Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Profit Minds podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch, creator of the Profit Minds Growth System, a unique blend of profit growth, productivity acceleration, and building robust business process for scale. In every episode, I interview entrepreneurs and small business owners from around the world with a unique story to tell. You can find the show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Well, hello, everyone. Today, my guest is Michelle Bomberger, founder and CEO of Equinox Business Law. Today, we're going to be talking about how to leverage legal as a competitive business asset. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Dr. Steve. How are you?
I'm doing great. So, the first question I ask every guest is, how did you get here? What's your story? So tell us yours.
Yeah, it's always a long story, but the journey really began when the idea of going back to graduate school sort of hit me to be a small business advisor. And so I'd been doing consulting work, decided to go back get my MBA. And as I was looking at programs, I thought that the legal degree as a differentiator, something that I could bring to a small business's toolkit would be really valuable. So I did the JD MBA, the long version of the MBA program, and never really thought I would practice law. That wasn't the path that I planned to take. And years go by, experience happens, still really hadn't practiced, but realized that there was a huge gap in the market for legal services for smaller companies. They just aren't served particularly well by the industry. And what that translates into is avoidance. And so what happens is they tend to just avoid using legal rather than being able to embrace it and leverage it as, again, a competitive advantage, a competitive asset for them to grow in a smart, proactive way. And so that was the foundation of Equinox, is really how do we serve businesses in a better way, and really encourage them to be proactive and have the tools that they need to be able to both strategically and tactically move their business forward.
So what does that look like for your clients? Does that do you like enter into sort of retainer kind of thing, or what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have, over the last 10 years or so, continued to sort of innovate and come up with a way for this to really work for smaller companies. And it is, as you mentioned, a retainer, but we build it on a 6-month forward-looking engagement that says, hey, what are the big projects that need to be done? And often there are a few big projects. Maybe it's an employee handbook or a shareholders agreement. Maybe it's now a privacy policy, the kinds of things that have been sitting there and are never going to come to the front of the pile, front burner of the stove. And we package those up along with anything else that happens. So we say, over the next 6 months, we'll do these big projects. And then the little stuff that shows up, just call us, and it's all included as well. So we do monthly 30-minute check-in meetings. Hey, what's new? What's happening? What do we need to know about? And begin to really understand the risk profile, risk tolerance of that business, as well as the industry and the dynamics of that business as well. And then are able to just continue to build on what they're doing now into the future. And every 6 months we say, what's next? And build from there.
So what are what are the biggest holes that you find for the typical small business?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different things depending on the business. I would say the 3 things that come up most frequently are employment. And for those who are out in the world right now, you probably saw that there's a new federal ban on non-competes. And this sort of patches into all the different state work that's been happening. So employment is just this constantly changing space. And as folks have moved into remote workers across the country and around the world, this is becoming more and more complicated. So that's probably one of the number 1 areas. Second is contracts. And contracts is a mix of, does your contract do what it needs to do? And does your team know what it says, so that when someone pushes back, someone asks a question, they have a good baseline of like, hey, here's our standard, and here's what it means when someone wants us to change it. And then the third is sort of governance and succession. So really understanding what happens in a business if the owners or the key people, can't show up to work tomorrow, whether that's planned or, unintended or unexpected. So things like operating agreements, shareholder agreements, equity relationships, those types of things are probably the number three. And then kind of beyond that, we have some real estate IP. Privacy is becoming another huge area, data privacy. So depending on the business, those things percolate up as priorities as well.
Yeah, interesting. So, yeah, you touched on the whole legal hiring, employees stuff, and I know that I live in California, and California, I think, probably is the most complicated, from what I've heard anyway. I don't know if that's really true or not. But are you able to handle that sort of anywhere in the country?
Well, as you're kind of alluding to, lawyers do have licensure requirements in different states. So we work with clients specifically in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and soon in Colorado. We have not ventured into California yet, mostly because it would require me to take the bar exam there, which I'm not quite ready to do. We hire someone there, which I'm also not quite ready to do.
Yeah.
But we do have clients that are based in jurisdictions where we do practice that have employees all over. And so we do help them navigate those employment laws across the country, because it's just become, post-COVID especially, it's become this massive endeavor to become up to speed with all of your employment documents and registrations in each state.
So let me make sure I understand this. So you can, because of the bar requirements and all that kind of stuff, you can practice and be I think you call it the chief legal officer for companies that are headquartered in those various states that you listed: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, soon Colorado, right? But if they have employees in other states, you can still help them. Is that, am I hearing that correctly?
That's right. Most states have a temporary practice of law kind of exception, where if your client who is in your jurisdiction where you are licensed has an activity occurring in that state, then you can support them on a temporary basis with those issues. Again, every state is a little bit different of how they define the practice of law and the unauthorized practice of law, but that's sort of a good general basis.
Okay. And how would I figure out what the big holes that I have are as a small business owner?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's a few ways. I think the first is to have a really good team of advisors that you talk with. So you should have, your banker, your insurance broker, someone on the tax and financial planning side. If you have a business coach, that's another great asset, or someone who's an outsourced HR. So, who are those right advisors that you need who can really help you to be proactive in thinking about where your business is and where it's going. And then having kind of tools that help you to stay on top of what's happening out there in your industry and in the law. It's really hard because there are so many different moving parts. We've developed a tool we call our business health assessment. It's available on our website, and it is about, I don't know, between 5 and 10 minutes, depending on who you are, to kind of go through the assessment. And it delivers a report that kind of goes through the what we call the spirit, the mind, and the body of the business, and thinking about how strong you feel you are in those areas. And then based on those responses, kind of gives you some, hey, you should be thinking about these types of things. Everything from, your strategy and core values to your decision-making approaches in your business to facilities management and IP. It kind of takes the gamut, but hopefully gives people some food for thought that they can use both internally with their leadership team, but also with all of their advisors to say, hey, what do you think? And I think it's a great tool to just kind of like start the pie in the sky what ifs about how we feel about what's going on in our business.
So that's a much broader assessment than just where are your legal holes. This is
right. So when we talk to clients about how to think about risk in their business, because that's ultimately what legal is. It's a risk management tool for the most part, right? And that is both, again, strategic and tactical. We talk about the different tool sets that are available. And I call that legal infrastructure. So across the business, from, again, strategy to tactics, do you have the right legal infrastructure in place? And I comment on three kind of tools, and these are flow throughout this business health assessment report. The first is your contracts, right? So do your contracts insulate the risk of that relationship in its terms? Do we have dispute resolution procedures? Are we clear on responsibilities and expectations? And so you hope that if something happens, the contract will insulate that relationship and those damages. And sometimes there's no contract, or sometimes the contract doesn't cover it. And so then you go to look for insurance. And so we call it insurance kind of your second line of defense. What do you have? What do you not have? What can be covered? What can't be covered? But if this issue explodes outside of the contract, then do we have insurance? And then worst case, if we don't have insurance, we have our entity. And so that's where sort of this governance and entity structure and limitation on liability for owners. And so some relationships use all three. Some relationships use only one, but understanding kind of how different parts of your business apply these tools to manage risk. And legal is sort of this overarching, like, how do we think about the risk tolerance and risk profile of the business to apply these different tools to kind of balance that risk as best as we can.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, the way you describe the layers of protection, right? The contract. I mean, and you know, and I'm kind of surprised that the insurance comes in between the contract and the legal entity structure. So say a little more about what are the kinds of things that you need to make sure are in the contract. Let's start there.
Yeah. And again, you know, every relationship is different. Every contract is different. We've all seen our 75-page leases compared with our, 2-page independent contractor agreements, for example. So they're all a little bit different. But when you think about what could go wrong in a particular relationship, so what is the scope and scale of what could go wrong? And you may have heard this before, experienced this in your work before, is that humans are generally not particularly good at evaluating risk, right? Afraid of getting on an airplane, but happy to drive, on a freeway. And your odds are certainly worse on the freeway than they are in the air, all things being equal. But so
statistically speaking, anyway.
Exactly. I mean, again, if something happens with the airplane, your odds of surviving are certainly less. But really thinking about what does that relationship present as both opportunity and risk, and thinking through then what are the tools or what are the provisions we need to have in place to protect us given those scenarios. So rather than looking at the boilerplate that people say is, oh, the second half of the contract, it's all boilerplate. Well, the words in those provisions actually are different depending on the contract and depending on the relationship. And so things like indemnification, limitation on liability are some of the most critical elements over, because the business is focused on the business terms, which is perfectly reasonable, but they do matter. And so the number of times that we've seen an indemnification provision or a limitation on liability provision that doesn't make any sense for the relationship because someone just grabbed it from someplace else and popped it in there. Similar with dispute resolution. So what is the right kind of way to handle a dispute in this relationship? It may not be the same for every kind of relationship you're in. You may actually want to go to court first for some of these versus this, mediation, arbitration, warm and fuzzy, let's try to resolve it together. Again, totally depends on the relationship.
Interesting. Okay. And then from so assuming you have the contractual stuff in place and something goes sideways, which it can, because we're human beings, and somebody may decide that, they're going to challenge some of the provisions or whatever, that then you have your insurance layer, right? So what is that? What's your kind of, again, I'm going to generalize this, but
Yep.
let's talk about some of the kinds of things that you can do. I assume errors and omissions is one. What are the kinds of frameworks that you talk about in insurance and risk limiting?
Yeah, I think the lease of facilities is actually a really great example, right? So if you have a lease and the lease talks about the obligations of, the tenant to maintain the property, and if something bad happens, the tenant has to pay the landlord, for those damages. Those damages may be outside the control of the tenant. It's not like they went in there with a sledgehammer, but there was some sort of a storm or some sort of a fire, whatever that is. The contract says that the tenant has to pay for it. So you're not going to get the money out of the contract. You simply have a means of taking the next step. So then you go to your insurance and you say, hey, this bad thing happened. Do we have insurance coverage for it? And, the insurance company, you hope will say, absolutely, let us help you. Doesn't always happen quite that way. But, if it's a fire, they would typically cover it. But if it was arson, they typically wouldn't, right? If it was an earthquake, we all know how difficult it is to obtain earthquake insurance. And so you may not have coverage for that. So let's say that it is a situation where you have a significant damage owed to the landlord. You do not have insurance that's going to help you with that. And ultimately, you may need to close the business down because you can't pay that liability, right? You're just stuck. And so the entity gives you, assuming you didn't sign a personal guarantee on that lease, that's a whole nother thing. Assuming you don't have any persons, you're able to say, you know what, that $500,000 worth of damage, I can't absorb that. So, take it and I'm going to walk away. So we call that kind of, that's the worst case scenario in many cases, but it's there for a reason. It exists for a reason. So that's kind of one I think easy-ish example to walk through how the three things sort of interplay with one another.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm fascinated by this this whole arrangement that you have with the big projects, and then whatever little stuff that goes on there. And you say those are typically like 6-month engagements?
Yeah, so we build them typically on a 6-month engagement, and we start out with this business health assessment. So that's kind of the tool that we typically start with our clients, go through that together, because they often will be coming to us with something specific. Hey, we have this thing we really want you to look at. So that's usually what's first and foremost on their minds. So we have a conversation about what else is happening in your business, and where do you expect to be a year, 3 years, 5 years down the road? What are we building toward? What kinds of things are on your mind? And then what do we need to sort of backfill and fix? And so those first projects are typically a mix of, fixing things that have been backburnered for so long, but also, we expect that we are going to, hire an executive and give them, some sort of equity, right? Those are forward-thinking things. So in the next 6 months, what do we want to tackle? And so we work together to determine what we want to tackle. And then during that period, we build a fixed price solution for that 6-month period. So it is a fixed price. And then during that period, if they get a nasty letter, they send it over, and that's something we just handle for them. Or they end up, so a law changes in a state where they happen to have an employee, we will, handle that for them. They have a contract review. So those types of things are built in, and sometimes their unexpected needs, their ad hoc needs are greater than what we had anticipated. And so we just move some projects around in order to kind of, balance those things out. And so it really is a mutual relationship where it kind of works for both of us. And we just kind of keep moving things and adjusting as needed in order to get the most prioritized items taken care of. And what they find is that legal is much bigger in their business than what they ever expected. Because if you think about why a large company has a general counsel, they have someone who's overseeing, like, where are we going and all the moving parts around that. And so we give that to these small companies. And when they realize that they could just hand off all these things that their team is spending hours on, they're spending hours on contracts, they're spending hours on HR stuff, they're spending hours trying to find the answer to something when they could just throw it over the fence. And so then we start to get this idea of what is the core of this business? What are the key things that happen all the time? And build that into an ongoing plan that frees up their team to be able to do their best work rather than spending time doing legal work that they, shouldn't be doing anyway.
Right. Well, or worse, they're sweeping it under the rug because they don't know how to do it, and they don't even know what questions to ask. And I think from my perspective, that's the real advantage of this health assessment that you offer is it's just, at least you're aware of all of the stuff that you're not doing.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah, and that's kind of what one of the things we hope is there's probably 75% of it that most folks are pretty, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And then every now and again, there's something that pops up. They're like, oh, I don't know about that. Hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you also handle, IP kinds of concerns, trademarks and patents and things like that as well? Do you handle?
We do copyright and trademark in-house. Patent is a whole nother monster. And honestly, just doesn't come up all that often. Trademark and copyright are things that come up pretty regularly in small companies. Patent doesn't come up quite as often, and it does require a whole nother set of skills.
Right.
And so we have friends who do that much better than we do.
That's great. So, Michelle, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach out? What's the best way to find out what's the next step?
Yeah, so probably the easiest way is on our website at equinox.law. There's a link to our team page, and you can message me through that, or email me directly, michelle@equinoxbusinesslaw.com. We're also very active on LinkedIn, always providing legal updates and other kind of small business related updates. So take a look there and follow us if that's a space where you get your information as well.
Yeah. And be sure to look for that business health assessment out on their website. That sounds like a really great idea.
It's a great tool. It's a lot of fun to go through with clients.
Great. And that concludes our show. Thanks to Michelle Bomberger, founder and CEO of Equinox Business Law. I hope you learned something about leveraging legal as a competitive business asset. I know I did. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Profit Minds podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch. Please visit www.profitminds.net for other episodes or to contact me. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others. Thanks for listening. Have a grateful day.